to be here, and thank you to all of you who are here on a Sunday morning. Thank you very much. Today's presentation is part of Africa SF, a research project I've been working on for several years. It explores the link between fiction, digital culture, science, and utopias in Africa. You might wonder why I choose to cover such a huge continent as Africa in my presentation, a continent that is larger than the US, Europe, and China combined, rather than focus on one of its 54 countries. But as the economist Felwine Sarr stresses in his book Afro-Topia, published in 2016, African nations share a common destiny and recent history, as well as facing the same historical challenges. In 2008, for his first feature film, South African director Neil Blomkamp chose to return to his childhood hometown in Johannesburg, and more precisely in Chavelo, in the Soweto district. Blomkamp District 9 clever mixes style, war reporting, TV documentary, and science fiction. The film's worldwide success marked official entry into the universe of science fiction. The first images of the film depict an alien spaceship hovering above Johannesburg in 2010. As a genre, science fiction creates an effective displacement from reality, but Blomkamp's intention is without doubt to comment on his country's present day, to comment on a present that bears the mark of the South Africa history and has been molded by the same culture of technology that ended the apartheid. I guess that everybody here have seen the trailer, so I won't show the trailer. The media phenomenon that was District 9 fostered a growing interest in African sci-fi production, and it became apparent that District 9 was only on the tip of the iceberg. In other words, that sci-fi was part of the continent's roots and had been so for a while. But my purpose here is not to deliver a lecture on the history of African science fiction. For one thing, the research is fairly recent, and as yet, it has been difficult to date the emergence of the genre on the continent with any degree of certainty. Moreover, very few works produced in the 20th century were presented as science fiction, either by their author or the critics. Lastly, the appropriacy of the term science fiction in Africa is under debate. Kenyan director Wanuri Kayu is wont to stress that the continent has always called on science, both on imaginary sciences and all that is extraterritorial, to interpret the world and to tell story. But it's true that the 21st century really marked a step on this science fiction aesthetic. In 2008, still in South Africa, Cape Town more specifically, a collective of artists, intellectuals, and activists called Shimuranga created the Pan-African Space Station Radio. The same year, Shimuranga also published Dr. Satan et Co-Chamber. It was an opportunity to rediscover, for instance, Jean-Pierre Beccolo's 2005 film Les Saignantes, which pinned a dark tale of sex and politics set in an African city in 2025. Icarus 13, the installation by Angolan artist Kilwanji Kaanda, which documents the first Angolan space mission to the Sun, or The Diabolical Machine, drawn by Aboubakar Mansare from Sierra Leone. In 2011, Lauren Bukes from South Africa won the Arthur C. Clarke Prize for her book Zoo City, while Nnedi Okorafor won the World Fantasy Award for Wufi's Death. Those awards were key to increasing the visibility of African sci-fi. Afro-Naut, released in 2014 and directed by Francesc Bodomo, is a reimagining of the school teacher Edouard Maculan colossal grand design leading to the creation of the Zambian National Academy of Science, Space Research and Astronomical Research. In Zambia, in the 60s, in the midst of the USSR space race, Maculan Colosso was an eccentric astrophysicist who was convinced that he was the right person to help his country send the first Mars and in this instance, a woman on the moon. But those are but a few examples among many more. This is a time that is conducive to the development of African sci-fi, as the continent itself is undergoing major change economically, technologically, politically, and aesthetically. Firstly, because the idea that Africa will be the continent of the future is gaining traction, in contrast with trends elsewhere in the world, in Europe for instance, where the future seems to have become an obsolete concept, and in the US, where the notion has been taken over by the master of the Silicon Valley and their transhumanist project. Even though I think it's kind of myth, which benefits mainly major Western company, it is true that Africa is the continent that is going to see the most change over the 25 years, and several indicators suggest that some spectacular developments are in store. The 20th century will be the century of African demographic. By 2050, the population will have doubled, reaching 2.4 billion people, and around 41% of birth in the world will take place in Africa. It is the continent with the youngest population in the world. Currently, around 47% of Africans are aged under 18 years old. In 2050, under 25th will account for 50% of the population. Africa is the region in the world where urbanization is happening at the fastest rate. Currently, 40% of Africans live in cities. By 2025, close to 1 in 2 Africans will live in cities, and by 2050, that figure will have reached 60%. Contrary to pessimistic prediction made in the 90s, digitization has not created a new divide, causing Africa to lag further beyond economically. Instead, the continent has massively adapted to information and communication technology. In 2000, there were 60 million active mobile phones in circulation. By the end of 2011, the number of mobile phone subscribers has reached 620 million, which is higher than Europe and the US. Partly carried by the African diaspora that trained in the major international higher education system, African scientific culture has been making leaps and bounds thanks to a series of initiatives that have afforded greater media visibility. In March 2016, the first edition of the Next Einstein Forum was held in Dakar. It was attended by 500 scientists from all over the world. 50% of were representative of the African continent. The Next Einstein Forum is convinced that the next Einstein will be African, and that Africa will be the world's next global hub of science and technology. And a growing number of countries are publishing stating their space research ambition. There is some of the space projects in Africa. The continent youth is proud of belonging of the generation of the 300 million connected Africa who live in a binary code continent and for whom chat, SMS, sharing, page loading, downloading are just a second nature, as for the Japanese and the Americans, says Shep Sumba, founder of the African Digital Art Platform. In a piece called Developing World, Beyond the Frontier of Science Fiction, Jonathan Dotsey, a student at HSC University College in Ghana and founder of the Afro-Cyberpunk blog, introduces himself as one of the million of the generation, I quote, born with globalization. We are the children who grew up with Nigerian film and Kung Fu film, indie video clip and gangster rap, Transformer, Spider-Man and Ananse, the BBC, RFI and the Deutsche Welle. We are the Nintendo PlayStation generation. The blogger is the living testimony of the fact that young people in developing countries are shaped by the most radical technology, which have unprecedented access to. As a result, we see the emergence of a mindset that is completely different to the state of mind that has prevailed until now, with an awareness of the huge potential of science and technology to foster social change. Jonathan Dotsey says, what happened when the youth of the third world had access to technology that was practically unimaginable a few years ago? What should we expect if that trend continues for, say, another 50 years? Who best answer those questions? Science fiction writers, of course. In his optimistic version, sci-fi is the symbol of a claimed pride, black pride, as expressed by the desire to define the continent own metaphor for the future and to reinstate its history. Africa is rising up again. There's going to be trouble, say Caleb Ritobai, the musician and lead singer of the band Afro-Tronics. Fusing traditional Chadian rhythms such as gourma, sai and dara with electronic music, he has created the sound of a continent eager to outline its own trajectory toward 2050. We Africans can write our own future. Ever since colonization, we have let the major power to tell us who we are. This must stop. Self-proclaimed ambassador of a continent reinventing itself as the lab where globalized hypermodernity is being created, Afro-Tronics perform in a distinctive, stylish white outfit and headgear, chosen as visual symbol of a pared-down futuristic Africa.
Sinon le pays va tomber. Le pays va tomber. Sinon le pays va brûler. Le pays va brûler. Sinon le pays va tomber. Le pays va tomber. Sinon le pays va brûler.
Beyond that, media theorist Scott Bukatman is a proponent of the notion that the sci-fi aesthetic is the essence of the ultraliberal techno-scientific society that is beginning to take over the entire world. In Africa, it's being met with the emerging local capitalism that is assimilating the entire entrepreneurial class. And animation and video game, the two cultural industries that are at the most in sync with this economical model, are booming. Both are bursting with superhero stories in a futuristic backdrop. One example is EXO, an animation featuring a nanotechnology expert named Wale William as its main protagonist. EXO was created in Lagos by the unique studio. Another example is a South African series Yongo, starring superhero Eli King, who acquired his superpower thanks to a crystal passed on by his father. As for the video game, Nairobi X, set and created in Kenya, features alien landing on Nairobi. Africa may well be the continent of the future, but 1 in 2 Africans is nevertheless currently living in deep poverty. The combination of a population with a majority of young people, high unemployment rates, rapid urbanization, and government current inability to meet energy needs is one that is prevalent in many countries and has the potential to be explosive. The mineral used to manufacture most electronic products, coltan, wolframic, and gold, are primarily a source of conflict because they are so sought after. And for several years, the continent has sheltered some of the largest landfills of e-waste in the world. May the dystopian sci-fi genre bear duty to the description of a continent caught up in its own contradiction. Indeed, the primary aim is not so much to imagine utopian progress as to draw attention to the stark contrast in Africa. Sci-fi is a critical and political tool which has become a relevant way of discussing the future state of choice currently made in the continent. What will the consequence of the demographic boom of 2030 and 2050 be? What will become the continent after the irreversible effect of climate change? Which invisible power are we dependent on? In 2030, 1 in 2 Africans will live in a city, but poverty will not have been eradicated. And Nigerian architect, designer Olaleka Ndeifun warned that it will likely have crept into the heart of megalopolis. Shanty megastructure is digital illustration are stacked with shacks as tall as skyscrapers, creating vertical shantytown, a far cry from the conquering futuristic iconography of real estate advertisement all around the major African city. As early as 2004, Neil Blomkamp was already imagining a scenario where city had become large-scale staging ground for weapon manufacture. In Tetraval, a video styled to resemble an advert, a company boasts of its ability to build humanoid robots that can help the police in developing countries.
It gives me a lot of information regarding what's going on there because it provides real-time video feed, and I don't have to put an officer right in front of the place, so it's quite an advantage having this.
Info on 22. Hold on, there's 70, 01.
A really skilled sniper or somebody who's trained a lot can almost match that. But introduce a bit of stress, a bit of heat, a bit of cold, a bit of fatigue. They're downhill, and this thing is just it's unbeatable.
Primary on here for the Joe, give your push on speed.
In his last book, published in 2015, L'impérialisme postcolonial, critique de la société des éblouissements, sociologist Joseph Tonda shine a torch on the strange time we are living in. Though we have barely acknowledged it, we have entered an era of postcolonial imperialism in which the African continent is subjected to the same liberal techno-capitalist economic regime as the rest of the world. The way in which this imperialism exerts its domination are all but invisible. It colonizes our subconscious and feeds on our longing for power, material goods, and sexual pleasure. This complex model is the product of the mutation of capitalism and the advent of screen devices. Screens all at once, and I quote him, fascinate, seduce, enthrall, control, captivate, oppress, haunt, and ultimately colonize the collective imagination and unconscious. Hypnotized by the image of our screen, technology eventually makes zombie of us all. In the video South African artist François Knoets made for his Cape Mango series, strange monsters emerge from local landfill, trashy zombies intent on making their presence known to the inhabitants of the mythological city Cape Mango, a city whose foundation are consumerism promoted by the screen civilization. The artist's intention is to speak out against the South African society that is built on a fundamental dichotomy, a white minority with all the power, pursuing power as well as the power to produce the accompanying narrative myth, and a black majority that is kept in the lumpen proletariat, producing objects for the minority and processing of the ensuing waste.
All ages. This film's name is
Have set out for Mongo on a mission of...
It was the older days, but now it's in the Newton days.
On the African continent, there are those who have suggested that if Africa wants to create a promising future for itself, it will need to undergo a deep cultural revolution. This is the thinking behind economist Felwine Sarr's latest book, Afro-Topia, a book which is, in the author's own words, an active utopia. Sarr believes that the main problem Africa needs to address is a shortage of thinking and producing its own metaphor for the future in order for the continent to reflect on itself, represent itself, and project itself. Sarr advocates that Africa distance itself from the development model conceived by Western power and held up as the golden standard for Africa, regardless of the human, cultural, and social cost. According to Sarr, the African continent needs to make a clean break and embark upon an archaeological mission to rediscover local culture if it wants to establish local models that are, and I quote, more aware and mindful of the balance between various orders and of the common good and dignity. Beyond that, Africa must find its own strengths in order to play an active role in carrying humanity to another level. Keeping in mind, I would like to present a final series of work. The Democratic Republic of Congo artist Maurice Hermers Bikayi analyzed the impact of digital technology on the continent and explored the way it permeates local culture. That is to say, an African who has been fundamentally changed by digital technology, but Bikayi also adapted concepts taken from the Luba culture in the view of the effect of technology. In the trilogy Afro-Galactica, A Brief History of the Future, Canadian artist Kapani Kiwanga plays an anthropologist living in 2100 in the United States of Africa, a confederation created in 2058, 100 years after the All-African People Conference in Accra. Kapani's anthropologist goes back in time in search of the myth, technological innovation, and scientific invention that have paved the way to our current reality. Essentially, through the genre of science fiction, Kapani retraces Africa's step from the past into the future. Rather than sending its e-waste to poor countries, namely in Africa, why wouldn't Western countries send them to Mars instead? Asked the WayLab, an arcospace in Lomé. The 3D printer Wafat will be the first in a series of machines embarking on a new space adventure. Mars thus becomes a center for the treatment and recycling of waste, which produce semi-autonomous machines furthering space exploration, which by no means preclude fighting against pollution on Earth. The French-Guyanese artist Tabitha Razar is part of a generation whose artistic training is marked by the omnipresence of the internet. In 2014, she directed Afro-Cyber Resistance, a video in which she denounced the Western imperialism of the internet. In 2016, in the exhibition Exotic Trade, Tabitha Razar widened the scope of her diagnostic and her intervention. The internet is sick. We must treat all those as contaminated. The artist called the spiritual dimension and scientific ancestral African knowledge and Kemetic Kundalini yoga to reconcile body and mind. As a conclusion, for me, the aim of Africa ISF project is to use science fiction as a resource to participate in the writing of other stories in order to reclaim a state in the present and in the future. When the tool we had previously used to reflect upon the world outlives their usefulness, philosopher Donna Haraway encouraged us to turn to storytelling. And I quote, "As far as I'm concerned, what I want is to create stories. The only way I know how it will is to call on creative joy, terror, and collective thought." And just to finish, I hope the project we are developing with Marion from Kirchesan next year, based on the non-aligned utopia, will be a story for a better future. And I thank you.